I'm going to read Client Transcript, which was published in Queer Words, issue number 7. So, Client Transcript by Robert Adams. On the morning of the 14th of November 1956, John Morgan died. I know he died because I was with him at the time. So you can imagine why it came as a bit of a surprise seeing him at the pedestrian crossing at the bottom end of Broughton Street as I stood in the queue of the post office waiting to be served, unaware as I was that I had exceeded the 5-minute limit guarantee they now gave when waiting to be attended to. I didn't dash out or do anything so rash. It had been a good 40 years since his death, and there was only one person now in front of me in the queue, and I had no intention of standing in excess of yet another 5 minutes. The assistant looked faintly harassed, and I almost felt a pang of sympathy for her as I made my complaint. Almost. I demanded a form in which to make it official and placed the package I intended sending onto the scale. After a bit of a kerfuffle, I received the complaints form and stamps on the package, which I then placed on the window recess with a pile of other packages and envelopes too large for the postbox. I pocketed the form and made my way out, down the stairs and across the lights in search of John Morgan, the man who had died all those years previously. John and myself had been partners. We had lived together on and off, and were so at the time of his death, which is why I had been with him and why I knew he is not now alive. No matter who or what I think I saw, glancing over his shoulder as he passed the chemist on his way in the direction of the junction at Broughton Street and London Road. Session 1. No, the relationship had never been smooth, although it did last a good 18 months before the real first split. John had been sitting in his desk as I packed my stuff, and he seemed fine until I stripped the bed covers. I could see him fight the tears. He was more the romantic than I. He'd thought we would be together forever, yet sitting there trying not to watch me manoeuvre my way through our belongings, it must have struck him that this could be the end. Every relationship has its problems, and John would say ours were mere teething. 18 months on, and it must have appeared as though the teething would be no more. Forever and a day had passed, or at least so it seemed at the time. He had tried putting on a brave face and using that attempt at sarcasm of his. "Is that it?" he'd said. I'd hate you to forget anything." I'm sure I ignored him, or just said I'm away or something. I'd known him long enough to read what he was really saying. He sat looking at the floor with his eyes tightly closed and hardly breathing. That was his way of halting the plea I knew was probably rushing towards his tongue at that very moment. I closed the door and descended the stairs. I don't think it was intentional, but you can never tell. I had left my spectacle case perched under a pile of papers on his desk. He had noticed them and come rushing out onto the landing. "Iain," he had shouted. I stopped. I put down the case and looked up, and I think he must have seen a tear. He stared and tried to speak, but his voice was so choked he couldn't. There were a mass of things flying through my mind then, and I'm sure I said yes in response to words he hadn't even uttered. "Your glasses," he said. "You forgot your glasses." He wafted them over the banner, and I almost lost control. All I could say was, "Oh." He flung them down towards me. I caught them, picked up the case, and continued down the stairs. It wasn't even a full week later. It was Tuesday night, and the club was full as usual. It was one of those theatre bars that people went to in those days, the Unity Bar if I remember rightly. I sat huddled in the corner trying to be left alone, but not alone, guzzling the gin and eyeing the scene in that way, you know, with that stare which is enough to keep most at bay. Well, most except the odd desperate and the few faces that recognise you enough to pass a word or two. The club had been painted black, and I sat in the corner under the newly installed neon lighting, and the place was stifling. It was full-on theatre lovies as usual, which would normally excite me, but not that night. I sat watching nothing in particular, and it was then that I saw him. I couldn't remember a name, but I recognised the face from when John and myself had lived together. He was one of John's exes, and one he had always thought to be particularly stunning. I'd never agreed. So, I moved from the corner where I sat and sidled up the bar. I had a good look from head to foot and back again. "Hi, I'm Iain," I said, or something equally inane. "Yeah, I know, I'm Alistair." We had ended up back at his place and had stayed for 3 days. I was a student, you see, in those days, and so revelled in the comparative freedom. We lounged around and had sex and ate lots and talked about all sorts of things, though it was his involvement with the nationalists which caught my attention. This was something he had in common with John. For years John had been a member of the Scottish National Party and had tried desperately to get me to join. I never had. By the end of the third day though, Alistair had me enthralled. He had revealed a scheme he and some friends were working on to bring back the Stone of Destiny to Scotland, to steal it. I had laughed and laughed and was gripped by the very notion of stealing back that which was rightfully ours, the symbol of our subjugation embedded in the coronation chair at Westminster, useful only to be sat upon. I'd phoned John's sister, as his parents had died years previously, asked if she had heard from John recently, or if there was any reason to think he had come back. She hung up. Well, I'd been going up Leith Walk, you see. It must have been quite early, 9:10 or thereabouts. As I'd reached the lights at Waterloo Place, a figure standing at the steps in the post office building caught my attention. He couldn't have been more than 50 feet away and staring straight at me. It was John Morgan, dead and standing outside the post office on a Wednesday morning. He made one of those soft little grins, which when aimed in my direction made it all worthwhile. At least I'm sure he grinned. He was also quick. Perhaps I just needed that grin for old time's sake. But either way I saw him. I know I did. In fact, I know I did, because I remember thinking at the time, for someone who's been dead and cremated all these years, he was still looking remarkably good. Still as trim as ever. John had been quite a bit older than I was, but for all the age difference, he had always been the fitter one, and looked far more taut and sleek than I ever did. As I made my way across the road, there was a bend, a blind spot, and I knew in my heart he wouldn't be there when the post office came into view once more. I stood for such a long time, contemplating why he should have returned, and why he wouldn't speak. I sighed, unable to make anything of it. I made my way to the library before heading back the way to the Blue Moon and my daily read of the papers. Session 2. Yes, I miss him. Not, of course, as I did back then, that first time we had split up. They were 3 months of hell, which is probably why I had gotten so involved with Alistair and his cronies. And the so-called plot to steal the stone, I had become more and more obsessed. It's so easy to see now that all I was doing was stopping myself from thinking of John through an involvement in something I knew he himself would have loved to take part in. They called themselves the Scottish Liberation Movement. A few students really, that's all. But committed, I'd thought.